Hi everyone, welcome to the AMA with Brendan Burns. We also have a few other guests joining us and we will be doing some introductions shortly. But first, I just have a few announcements. We will start this event with some questions that our moderator has pre-prepared, but we also would love to receive some questions from you all. So you should see an icon that is two text boxes with a question mark in the top text box. That is the live event Q&A, and that is where you can submit questions and comments. And to get that going, why don't we all put in where you are joining us from today? Throughout the event, I will also be sharing some links. One will be to our Reactor YouTube channel. That is where you'll be able to find the recording of this event in the next 24 to 48 hours, as well as recordings of our past events. I will also share a link to our meetup page and newsletter sign up if you want to see some of what other events we have, Reactor events we have coming up, as well as receive monthly updates. And finally, a link to our survey. If you do have a few minutes today, we would really appreciate if you could take some time and fill that out. It shouldn't take you very long, and we really appreciate the feedback. So now on to introductions. I will call your first name and then please introduce yourself. Brendan, we will start with you.
Hey there, I hope you can hear me, and apologies for being late. I'm Brendan Burns. I am one of the co-creators of the Kubernetes open source project. I'm also in charge of a bunch of different projects within Azure, mostly focused on DevOps and open source cloud native compute, including the Azure Kubernetes service and a bunch of others. So it's great to be here.
Great, and next, Lachie.
Hello everyone, I'm Lachie Evenson. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and our team works on open source cloud native technologies like Kubernetes, container runtimes, Helm, and many other projects. And we also make them run great on Azure. And you may have seen me in the community. I serve as a cloud native ambassador. I'm also on the Kubernetes governing, the CNCF governing board, and I was on Kubernetes steering, so I'm an emeritus there. Thank you. Looking forward to chatting with you all.
Thank you so much. And Sean, how about you?
Hey folks, I'm Sean McKenna. I'm the lead PM for the Azure Kubernetes service. So I partner with Lachie. He focuses really on the upstream open source side, and then my team takes a bunch of that great work that he does and really productizes it in the context of AKS. So everything to do with AKS roadmap and strategy is really within my purview.
Wonderful. And then Michelle.
Hey everyone, I'm Michelle. I'm a software engineer here at Microsoft. I work on open source tools around making containers and Kubernetes easier to use. I've been doing this for the last 5 years or so. I'm currently a core maintainer on the Open Service Mesh project as well as the Service Mesh interface project. And previously I served as a maintainer on Helm, Draft, CNAB, and some other cloud native projects. I also serve on the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee as a member, and I'm also a developer representative on the CNCF Governing Board.
Wonderful, thank you. And then our moderator today is going to be Bruke.
Hey everybody, I'm Bruke. I recently wrapped up my studies and joined the Azure Kubernetes Service PM team. Very excited to be here with you all today and moderating this session with a very wonderful panel.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And if you would like to start the questions now, that would be awesome.
Great. So thanks, Dion. A reminder to the audience to please keep sending in your questions. We're looking forward to an exciting session today. So my first question is actually for Brendan. What are some key trends that you're seeing in Kubernetes, and how do you see Kubernetes evolving in response to these trends?
Sure. I mean, I think that the broad trend that we've seen for the last few years has been the evolution of the sort of extension ecosystem or the custom resource ecosystem, where while Kubernetes continues to change and get developed, the real innovation and the bulk of the change that's happening is in the things that are being built on top of Kubernetes. And from service mesh, like what Michelle mentioned, to operators, and a bunch of other stuff, we're really seeing innovation in the things that people build on top. And as part of that, I think there's a real focus on improving productivity for application developers on top of Kubernetes. It's really still way too hard to build a cloud native application. And so the areas I think that I'm most excited about are things that help make that an easier process, like the Dapper project that we have going on out of Microsoft, but there's a lot of examples of this.
Excellent, excellent. Very wonderful points. I actually want to pivot the next question to Lachie around the topic of enterprise challenges and how Microsoft's strategy really helps address them. So the question is specifically looking at operational efficiency is top of mind for many organizations, especially in light of the current COVID situation. So what are the common pitfalls that you see when organizations are operating Kubernetes? And do you have any guidance or best practices that folks can consider when it comes to cost savings and efficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I think one of the common pitfalls early in most people's Kubernetes journeys is not setting up resource limits actually on their pods or their deployment specifications. And what resource limits allow you to do is signal to the Kubernetes scheduler where to place these workloads and how much resources that they'll actually need. So in lack of having those things defined in your deployment specification, Kubernetes will place them anywhere and have no knowledge of how much resources they consume. So this is a common pitfall early in the journey. So I think one of the things is adding those resource limits for both CPU and memory can really save you a lot of heartache in scaling and understanding how things are being consumed. So moving on from there, let's say you put these resource limits in place. What you can do is actually use something like Azure Monitor to drill down into how much CPU and memory are all these workloads taking, because one thing I hear commonly is, well, how do I know what to set these to? So with Azure Monitor, you can actually drill down and look at those workloads, look at how much they're consuming, and then change those resource limits to actually match what's being used there. And that really helps your operational efficiency. So once you've done that, you've set some limits, you've used Azure Monitor or some other tooling to introspect how much resources these workloads are using, you can apply an autoscaler as well. So you can apply an autoscaler to actually scale out the nodes you need, not only up, but down as well. So if nodes are sitting idle and aren't used, the autoscaler will actually move some of those workloads off to empty out a node and actually remove them from your Kubernetes cluster. So you can gain operational efficiency by doing that. So I'd say, out of the gate with something like AKS, you can turn on the autoscaler. You can start applying resource requests and limits and really start to get a handle on how much resources are your workloads using, and don't make a Kubernetes cluster that's too large and sitting largely idle. I think that's the first good step. I also hear a lot of enterprise customers saying, well, what about policy? What about policy? And when they ask what about policy, what they want to do is drill in to say, how do I define different aspects and limit the things that people can configure? For example, I want my company only to use a specific container repository. Can I make it so that all our developers only use a specific container repository and don't define any others? And there's a project out there that we work on called Gatekeeper under the Open Policy Agent project umbrella, which actually allows you to define this policy and have it expressed so that when a developer comes along and does a kube control apply, if it's not coming from that internally secured container repository, you can actually throw back an error and say, look, you can't deploy this workload because it's not coming from a secure container repository. So if you take appropriate resourcing, and then policy to say, do things actually, are they coming from the right place? Do they have resource limits? I think you can reduce a lot of the overall operational burden. And thankfully, with something like AKS, you can drill down to those aspects very quickly. Over to you, Bruke.
Thank you, Lachie. I think there's some really good guidance and really good best practices there. On that note, I want to pivot to Sean for my next question to discuss a bit more about how Microsoft has provided more innovation for Kubernetes. So oftentimes organizations need to deploy in public cloud, IoT edge, and so on. So what's Microsoft's strategy for hybrid and multi-cloud? And what specific investments are you working on to ease the pain of hybrid management?
Yeah, thanks, Bruke. Yeah, hybrid and multi-cloud, definitely a hot topic these days. I would start from saying, Azure's perspective is actually a little bit broader. Obviously, this conversation is really focused on Kubernetes as it's associated with KubeCon, but we actually think about it a little bit more holistically, which is to say, a lot of enterprise customers, when they're thinking about hybrid, Kubernetes is only a piece of the puzzle. They've got other resources, just raw servers, whether it's physical or virtual machines. They've got databases. They've got other resources that they're thinking about in that larger hybrid environment, and that sort of insight is really what is driving our investments around Azure Arc, which is the idea of taking the Azure control plane to the Azure Resource Manager, as well as a bunch of the sort of investments that we've done within the context of that around things like policy that Lachie mentioned, monitoring, RBAC, identity, just the way that we manage access to those types of resources, and making those available as something that can help you manage resources in any environment, whether that's in an on-premises environment, in customer's own data center, or in other public clouds. So that's kind of the foundational piece of the way that we think about hybrid. Now, obviously, Kubernetes is a big piece of that, and in fact, we see it as a foundational layer in the Arc strategy, and one that's going to enable a bunch of additional experiences that we can layer on top of it. So we have a capability that we're calling Azure Arc for Kubernetes, which basically allows you to take any Kubernetes cluster that is running, again, whether it be in an on-premises environment, actually even on your laptop, if you spun up a Kind cluster or K3S or what have you, or in other public cloud environments, connect that up into Azure, into the Azure Resource Manager, so that it gets its own identity, and you can then view it through the various clients that you might be familiar with, the CLI, PowerShell, portal, and so on. And then you can start to perform some management gestures on top of that. Again, things like setting up RBAC rules that would apply to that cluster, being able to monitor it just as you would an AKS cluster, and so on. And so really trying to blur the lines between really arbitrary Kubernetes clusters that might be running in other environments, and what you can do with the fully managed capabilities from AKS. The last thing I'll say, we've also heard from customers that are looking for, Azure Arc enables connecting arbitrary Kubernetes clusters, can be any distribution or managed Kubernetes service connecting up into that experience. We also hear customers are looking for something that's a little bit more opinionated and AKS aligned in terms of like a package Kubernetes offering that they can run in an on-prem environment. And so we recently announced the preview of AKS for Azure Stack HCI, which you can think of as that kind of prepackaged Kubernetes distribution that includes or that is aligned with and consistent with, to the greatest degree possible, understanding sort of the inherent differences between public cloud and on-premises environment, but as much as possible is aligned with the experience that you would get from AKS in the public cloud. So it simplifies standing up a cluster, upgrading it, scaling it, and so on. And we're trying to do as much as we can to have the sort of experience, the concepts, as well as a bunch of the configurations between those two different environments be as consistent as possible, so that as you're moving across, whether it's moving applications or moving sort of operational workflows across between those on-prem Kubernetes environments and AKS, that there isn't a sort of a massive chasm and cliff there. So I'd say that those are kind of the different irons that we have in the fire, and sort of the recommendations that we would have around hybrid.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sean. Definitely seems like there's a lot of exciting stuff underway, but also on the radar. So I'll direct my next question to Michelle. There's a lot of enterprises that are interested in innovating using AKS and other Azure tools and services. So to the organizations that are relatively new to cloud native application development, what are some key things that they should keep in mind as they embark on a journey to cloud native?
Okay, thanks so much. I think before you even get to cloud native application development, I think folks need to be really crisp about why they want to be cloud native in the first place, why they want to embark on their journey. A lot of people kind of just get carried away and really excited about a new thing, but I think it's really important, even if that's the right direction to go in for your organization, it's really important to be on the same page about why exactly you want to go in this direction. It might be because you want your applications to be more portable between different environments. It might be because you want your teams to be more agile. It might be because you want to reduce the cost of your infrastructure. There's a lot of different reasons why you would want to be cloud native, and reading case studies, watching conference talks around this kind of stuff is really helpful to get super granular about why. And that is actually going to impact the rest of your processes and practices and the changes that you will see in your organization or will want to achieve in your organization. So when you're actually getting started, I highly recommend really narrowing in and zoning in on your CI/CD pipeline and starting there. So you might have a target environment that you have for your cloud native environment. You might have a Kubernetes cluster running in the cloud or on-prem, but whatever it may be, set up a GitHub Action or an Azure DevOps pipeline or something that allows you to really get crisp about how you want to package your cloud native application, your application that you're going to deploy to your Kubernetes cluster. And once you've got that set in place, you can really work backwards from there in terms of picking the tools and technologies you want to use to actually develop your application. Highly recommend using VS Code. There are so many VS Code extensions to help you in your cloud native journey, whether it's inner loop development or with having the Kubernetes extension to let you introspect pods and resources and play with your Kubernetes cluster. There are so many different extensions and features and functionality that get unlocked by this one tool. And I made the switch after years of developing on Emacs and Vim, and I was so attached to my developer environment, but being on VS Code now has really changed the game for me and made me a lot more productive. So very much recommend that. I also recommend that once you're, kind of comfortable with deploying your application into the cloud, you're going to start figuring out what your workflow is going to be. And that might be a little manual the first few times that you do something to get to your end game, to your end goal. And if you find yourself repeating commands or the same steps in your workflow, there is a tool probably out there that will help you basically automate that workflow. And you should go find that tool. There's a vast array of tools. There's a cloud native landscape available, and there's a lot of open source tools to also choose from as well. So whatever tool you're picking, make sure it just basically replaces all those automated, it automates all the commands that you just are repeating over and over again. Another thing to think about when you're moving over to cloud native application development is really to think about the overall architecture of your system. You may need to change a few things about the way your apps run or just are deployed, and really think about your system as a whole. You need to be super crisp about what applications communicate with each other and what dependencies you have. You need to get really clear about those, otherwise there's a bunch of pitfalls. And you also need to be okay with your application instances disappearing. You need to design for failure. So keeping these two things in mind will just help you build more robust cloud native applications.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I think really understanding the why was definitely a big takeaway. And there's a question that's coming in from the chat for Brendan, specifically asking, is Kubernetes a tool for folks to build their own platform as a service when deploying it in big enterprises, or is it a tool for developers or mainly platform builders? So really getting to the core of understanding what is the purpose of Kubernetes and ensuring that the industry really has an underlying understanding of that.
I think it actually varies depending on the organization. Sometimes it is actually the platform for building platforms. So you'll see an enterprise applications group or an enterprise architecture group come in, and they'll actually define their architecture, and then they will almost hide Kubernetes from the rest of the organization, set up a GitHub action, set up a Git repo, and the developers just sort of know, hey, if here, app pops out over here. I think that can be a really great pattern. It's a little bit restrictive, and it puts a lot of load on that architecture team to do it right and to sort of take all the feature requests. But if you can achieve that consistency, it's pretty cool. We see other patterns where people are actually taking advantage of the ecosystem. So where they, it's not a platform architecture team, but they're installing a functions as a service runtime like Kata or something else that kind of gives a more developer-centric app on top of their Kubernetes cluster. And then we see some cases where the developers themselves are building applications. That tends to be environments that are a little bit more sort of DevOps centric, allow a little more freedom and flexibility to their teams, but also are willing to take on the risk and the upskilling that is necessary in order to make developers proficient. So I think it really depends on the organization and how centralized or decentralized your organization is, which pattern is going to be most successful for you. Kubernetes is out a lot, but it can also be a successful platform for building your applications.
Definitely. Thanks so much for that, Brendan. And I actually want to circle back again with you because I think there's some common interest in better understanding what your vision is on the future of Kubernetes now that you're currently with Microsoft and things have changed since creating it. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on where you see the future of Kubernetes and what the vision is for you.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I really think that all of the innovation is happening up above Kubernetes in the ecosystem of add-ons and extensions. And so that's where I think we're spending a lot of our time. It's where I'm spending a lot of my time. And I mean, we've been saying for years, this is probably the 4th KubeCon in a row that people have said Kubernetes is going to be boring this year. So I don't know. I don't know if that's going to happen, but we'll keep saying it. But I think it does represent the fact that the exciting stuff is happening in the things that people are building on top. And in some ways that means that there's a lot less vision because we're no longer one project. We're an ecosystem of projects. We're a foundation that everybody else builds their stuff on top of. I think that's really important. It's really valuable. And so I'm not really sure that Kubernetes or the Kubernetes project is in the business of setting a vision. I'll say from my personal perspective, I said this earlier in the intro, but building these applications is just too hard, right? It requires, it's sort of like embedded systems development or developing an application for a phone in 2000 as opposed to developing an application for an iPhone or an Android in 2010, right? Like we need to make it so much easier to build, to just sort of fall into a pit of success where you have a reliable, scalable application. And so if I had any vision, it would for what we're trying to do, it's that I can, go into VS Code and say file new project, and I can immediately fall into a place where I have an application that will scale, that will be easily deployable, that will have integrated tests and all of the stuff that you need to actually do things in production. I don't think we're there yet, but that's definitely where we're trying to get.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brendan. I think that's a great vision to have. I'll direct the next question to Sean on a specific aspect of AKS and Kubernetes, which is security. Security is a top priority for many enterprises, and at the same time, there's some uncertainty and unknowns because Kubernetes is an emerging technology. So how is Azure approaching security for cloud-native workloads, and what are some key resources or best practices in AKS to help with respect to security?
Yeah, great question. Another common one. And I think you mentioned a key phrase there, which is best practices. Customers are desperate for best practices across a number of different domains as they go and adopt Kubernetes. They're coming from some existing way of doing things and saying, hey, I spent years potentially building up knowledge and workflows and patterns around how to secure my environment, how to operate my environment in, say, an on-premises world or a traditional IaaS world. And now I'm jumping on this Kubernetes bandwagon, and there's all these different concepts and kind of how do I make sure that I can be productive, but not have blind spots that are a function of effectively my initial ignorance or naivete. And so that is broadly a big area of focus for us in the AKS world is making sure that all of those best practices that are getting developed by this massive community that's grown up around Kubernetes are things that a brand new user can consume either without knowing it or with a little bit of a nudge from the product. And so that is definitely one that we're focused on in the security space quite specifically, that hey, how you do a bunch of these different security techniques in a Kubernetes context is a lot to learn for people who are new. So how can we make it so that those things are, like I say, are available directly out of the box, or you're given a path forward to consume them. So there's a number of different aspects to that. We don't have time to go into all the different details here, but it runs the gamut from starting at development time and thinking about DevOps and your CI/CD pipeline and doing container image scanning, and then how you think about protecting the cluster itself in terms of access to the API server, potentially doing encryption of any data volumes that you might be attaching to the cluster, how you're doing secrets management. So there's potentially dozens, if not hundreds, of topics in the security space. I would point people to the best practices documentation that we have within the AKS docs. There's specific deep dive topics there around security to consume. The other thing that I would point people to is Azure Security Center. This is an experience that we've built across Azure to provide broadly two things across a number of different resources. One is evaluation of security posture. So looking at the resource, in this case, a Kubernetes cluster, and saying, have you done everything up front in terms of application of best practices for that particular domain to limit your potential exposure. And so in the AKS context, Security Center will do that evaluation and look for things like, have you locked down the API server? Have you either limited if you have a public API server, have you limited the IP ranges that can reach it, or have you adopted a fully private cluster? Have you turned on RBAC? Have you enabled Azure policy that we've talked about before? So doing that kind of initial inventory of the way that you've configured your cluster and ensuring that you've set it up for best practices. The second thing that it will do is actually at runtime look at the activity in the cluster. So specifically, it's reviewing the activity in the Kubernetes audit log, which describes who did what, when in the cluster and from what IP address and so on, and looks for potentially suspicious behavior. So things that are not necessarily active threats, but are more likely to be indicative of a threat, similar to maybe the way that your credit card company looks for fraud. And so then it'll surface those potential threats in the Security Center dashboard, and you can go drill in and see what exactly is happening, investigate whether that's in fact something to be concerned about. And so there's continued investments happening under the Security Center umbrella, specifically around Kubernetes, where we're trying to take our depth of knowledge around security best practices for Kubernetes and expose those in a way that's easy to consume for customers who are relatively new on that journey. So those would be sort of my top level recommendations, I would say.
Awesome, thanks, Sean. I think that's a great overview of some of the key resources and best practices. Michelle, I actually wanted to ask you a question on the topic of service mesh, open service mesh. How should a user interpret open service mesh and existing technologies like Istio and their relative place in the ecosystem?
Great question, thanks. To understand open service mesh and the service mesh space, you really got to take a step back and explain a service mesh interface. So SMI is a project that we've been collaborating on with the community as a whole, with with several other service mesh implementations. Basically, this is a specification that defines the common-most functionality that folks want from a service mesh as a set of APIs. And so service mesh implementations can go and then implement that set of APIs. And what users get is a very consistent experience across different implementations on for being able to do the basic things that they need to do. So like traffic splitting, canary deployments, A/B testing, things like that, or access control, like figuring out and locking down which services can talk to other services, and observability. So there is a metrics portion of the API which defines how you can get certain types of metrics, so golden metrics, success rate, error count, latency, things like that between your services and your applications. So this is what SMI is. It has three main components. Open Service Mesh is our take on a simple service mesh that's easy to use, that really just does the basic things that users need from service mesh. And so it implements SMI. And it is this project that I'm really excited to be a part of, actually. We're doing a lot of great things, building on top of Envoy Proxy, which is a CNCF graduated project, very robust proxy. And we're also, this thing runs on Kubernetes, but we're also going to work to extend it to run the mesh on VMs and functions and other platforms, so being able to extend the mesh. So there's a lot of really cool things going on in this project. It's part of the CNCF, it's open source, people are already contributing to it, and the key here is really simplicity. So this is something that we really aspire to. This project should be easy to understand. If you're interested in contributing, that should be, you should be able to do that. You should be able to understand how to do that. And we want to make this an open and collaborative effort because we've seen the pain that our customers have run into when it comes to service mesh, in terms of getting into situations where they don't understand why things are failing. Even onboarding onto service mesh is a really difficult thing, unless you really know what exactly you're trying to do. It can be a really tedious and difficult task. So we're really trying to ease the burden on folks who are trying to get the functionality that they want and require out of service mesh, while also making it a pleasure to work with.
Awesome, thank you so much, Michelle. I want to bring it back to Brendan, primarily talking about investments that are being made across Azure, across your team specifically. So I've heard of several Azure investments recently, such as confidential compute, event-driven programming model. Can you talk about these investments and the key investment areas on your team and how you are working to prioritize them?
Sure. I think every team is balancing operational responsibility, which takes frankly, takes a lot of time to ensure that our services are delivered successfully and that if there are problems, we resolve them. With sort of standard feature requests, could we, can you add the ability, like, for example, we just GA'd spot node pools. So can you have node pools with spot instances with more forward-looking innovation? And I think that the examples of the event-driven programming models and confidential computing are more in that latter category. And I think that, generally speaking, we aim sort of, I would say at like 50, 30, 20, 50-ish, something like that, where honestly, solid 50% of our time is spent in core operational responsibility. 30%-ish time is spent in features, and maybe 20% is spent in innovation. Some semesters it's even more than that. We spend even more time on operational aspects. Especially with a service that scales and has been growing as fast as AKS does. Just keeping up with the scale of growth, and this is actually true of Azure in general. Just keeping up with the scale of growth takes work. The things that used to be okay to do in a for loop suddenly need to be distributed out across a bunch of jobs to be fast. The processes that did upgrade to a clusters that were okay to run one version of, now you need to run it in a bunch of different regions. That's a good problem to have, obviously, but it does take time and effort. But if that was all you did, then we wouldn't be helping show people the way and show people what can be possible. And then also, as we think about financial services and other heavily regulated industries, things like confidential computing are incredibly important. And I think that it's something where, for now, it's a very specialized use case, where only a certain class of government or corporate users really require confidential computing, where your cloud provider can't see what you're doing. But I actually strongly suspect that in 2 years, it's going to be one of those things like private networking and otherwise that we just turn on for everyone, because everyone's going to ask for it, right? And no one's going to be okay running a container that their cloud provider could see the contents of its memory. And similarly with the event-driven programming and other developer productivity, people are going through a lot of pain right now to get their apps into Kubernetes. And then if we can help with that, that's great. I think in a few years, people are going to actually ban using the raw Kubernetes APIs for most developers, right? We're going to get into a place where there's going to be rules in these companies. And we're already seeing that, where people are saying, like, no, that's too low level. It's like using assembly language. Like, you can't do it. Like, you have to use these higher level primitives, right? I think that's our philosophy is to make sure that we're taking care of the nuts and bolts of why people are excited to use our service today. But also at the same time trying to reserve enough energy to build things that people will be excited about tomorrow.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brendan. I think that's certainly a great philosophy to have. I want to use this opportunity to circle back with Lachie. Michelle previously discussed understanding the why as folks embark on a journey at cloud native. But there's a question coming in for someone looking to create side projects or small projects. When does it make sense to make use of technologies like Kubernetes and cloud platforms?
Yeah, I think Michelle did a great job of covering it. But again, it's what is the problem you're actually trying to solve? There's a number of different ways and different technologies you could use, but never lose sight of the business problem you're trying to solve. Would be my advice. And having been in this situation before, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole and get wrapped around the axle looking at different technologies. But keep that business problem you're trying to solve. And if that's speeding up builds, speeding up time to get to stable releases, but Kubernetes allows you to actually have that experience where you can build an orchestrated platform from the ground up. And as Brendan mentioned, some teams are actually in the business or have staff to take care of building a platform that Kubernetes could actually power under the hood. So if you are looking at building from the ground up your Kubernetes implementation, if you have the staff to take on that operational kind of day-to-day to make sure that the care and feeding of all your Kubernetes infrastructure is taken care of, and beyond that, all your cloud native infrastructure, because Kubernetes is just the workload orchestrator, but then you have logging and monitoring and tracing and all this other technology that sits on top of that Kubernetes cluster that actually supports your business application and the business, what you're actually trying to achieve there. So, there's a lot of talk around, do I use a managed service, right? So for something like AKS, if you're not in the business or don't have the staffing to take care of something like Kubernetes, you can have a Kubernetes cluster just at the click of a button, and you can move on to actually solving the problems that you need to solve. So, side projects, obviously, if you want to get your hands dirty in something like Kubernetes, as Brendan mentioned, it's great. You can write your own custom controllers, you can extend it, you can make it your own, you can make it understand your workload. That's something that's all achievable with Kubernetes. But if you're not, in that business and you're trying to write some upper level abstraction, as Brendan was mentioning, making it easier for developers or trying to solve your business logic, having the nuts and bolts of understanding how Kubernetes operates, you probably don't need to do that. So it really depends on your use case and what you're staffed to do and what you're organizationally able to achieve. But more and more, I look at managed services as being a way just to get a Kubernetes cluster and not worry about all that operational burden and start at a higher level and start building there. So obviously, if you're building a side project that leverages Kubernetes under the hood, you have portability. You can take that application anywhere, and the Kubernetes APIs are a contract point. So as long as your provider or your Kubernetes cluster is upstream conformant, that workload will operate, which is a great place to start if you're building some kind of side project. Back over to you, Bruke.
Awesome. Okay, I think you summarized it very well. That brings to mind one question, which is a particular use case, which is machine learning. So I want to direct this question to Brendan. As many organizations are, increasingly deploying machine learning workloads on Kubernetes, how should a customer architect a solution for ML using Kubernetes? And generally, what are your tips and tricks for ML on Kubernetes?
Well, I think like is true of a lot of the stuff that we're doing. There's a lot of great frameworks out there now, right? And so I think starting from scratch is probably not the right thing. ML is a pretty complex thing to get right. I think it's great that container images make it pretty easy to start with a PyTorch or a TensorFlow. You don't have to worry about, some of these things are kind of hard to build, honestly. So you don't have to worry about all the different dependencies and, whatever, NumPy and all of the different things you have to sort of swizzle together to get a running machine learning thing. So the container images make that easy. But then there's Kubernetes frameworks that make the actual act of doing inference or training easy as well. Kifle is a popular one, and so I think that the standard advice of trying to find a solution out there already in the ecosystem, but even to Lachie's earlier point, maybe actually Kubernetes isn't the right fit for your AI. It may be that using something like Azure ML, Azure Machine Learning, a managed cloud service, which actually uses Kubernetes under the hood, but provides you with a much cleaner interface, is the right way to go about it. Or even, an AI service like cognitive services, where you can literally just like upload an image and get all the objects back from it, right? So you can, it's a pretty expensive proposition to turn up an ML capable Kubernetes cluster. You're running GPU instances, which are not cheap, and you need to generally run them at scale. And then model building is also hard. And so in many cases, using managed services is the right way to go, and actually skipping, and this is sort of a question that came up a bunch about like when do you use Kubernetes or not, skipping out of Kubernetes. But if you're doing your own learning, if you have your own training that you need to do, or you're a big company and you're just going to do machine learning as a skill set, having a team that develops specifically around machine learning, having a cluster dedicated to machine learning, makes a ton of sense. I don't think it's the sort of thing you don't want every development team to embark on doing their own ML. You want to have a dedicated team that is focused on ML, understands that particular ecosystem, because it's a different ecosystem than just the standard cloud native ecosystem. Understands the tools that are there, techniques, and because actually ultimately at the end of the day, success in ML is defined by how well you sort of model your inputs and your outputs. It's really not about the tech. It's not about Kubernetes or TensorFlow or PyTorch, or like, it's actually, your success is going to be how well do you actually understand what machine learning can do for you, and how well can you take your problem and make it fit nicely into what machine learning is good at. So it's definitely a specialized skill, and having a specialized team makes sense, or taking advantage of a cloud that has a specialized team. And in fact, some of the researchers who are even doing the next generation of work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brendan. To the folks on the call, if you have any lingering questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We'll be wrapping up in a bit, but I do want to surface two fun questions to Brendan. First, how did you transition from working in academia to working in the industry with Google and Microsoft? And two, a pretty popular question is, what are some of the new open source projects that you've been involved in or generally excited about these days?
So the transition, well, I've been writing a lot of code anyway. I actually had at the time, fairly, it was small, but a project that was used with Android for doing WYSIWYG design of Android applications that was out in open source land, and in 2008, and I've been doing a lot of coding on that. So like, it wasn't really much of a transition, I guess. I'd written a lot of code before. I'd only been in academia for 2 years also, I guess, at some level, so it hadn't been that long a time. And with regards to the projects that I'm working on right now that I'm excited about, well, I continue to work on the Kubernetes clients, on all of the client libraries for Kubernetes. For Java, in particular with Java, actually, there's some really incredible work that's going on there. It used to be that to write a really high performance operator for Kubernetes, you had to write it in Go, because all of the like high performance and utility things like informers and stuff like that were all written in Go. Almost all of that stuff has now been ported to Java as well. And so if you want to write a really efficient high performance operator in Java, we have all of that available to you, which is super cool. But we're bringing similar stuff to TypeScript and to C# as well. So I'm really, that's probably what I work on most actively. That's what I code on most actively. But I've also been helping, I mentioned earlier, with the Dapper project, which is really focused on developer productivity and sort of being a standard library for containers. So if you think of Kubernetes as being a runtime, like the JVM, you still need a standard library, and Dapper is sort of trying to start being a standard library for that. And that's going to get to 1.0 production readiness any day now. So really excited to see that, and it's ready for people to take on their production use cases to simplify things like accessing secrets or accessing storage or receiving events or anything like that. So that's what I'm working on. Obviously, I'm also actually really excited. Michelle already talked about it, but I'm really excited about OSM. I think there's some really awesome stuff going on over there. Bruke, you are muted.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I'm unmuted. I was just saying, thank you.
I was in a meeting the other day with someone who had a T-shirt that said, "Yeah, you're muted." on it.
Much needed now. The point you made about runtime actually prompted one question, and I'm sorry to go back to a serious question after asking you a pretty fun question, which is how's the move to containerd as a runtime, as a container runtime for Kubernetes going, and is the ecosystem ready for that?
Well, I hope it's ready for it because we're doing it with 1.19 on AKS. You know, with when Kubernetes 1.19 hits GA in AKS, it's going to have containerd as at least that's the current plan. So we've done a bunch of testing, and people have been using it on AKS because you can use it on AKS in preview. So we think it's ready. I think actually we're probably a little late to the party, honestly. I think other people have been using it for a while, and so I think it's been going pretty reasonably. I think it's one of those details where like people only notice if it breaks, you know, and so hopefully nobody notices, and it's not a big deal, and you know, we just sort of keep on moving. But yeah, no, I mean, I think we're ready. And I probably need to do it to my home cluster. My home cluster is not running containerd yet. I need to next upgrade. Maybe I will take my home cluster over to containerd also.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Thanks so much, Brendan. And on that note, I think we've hit on a wide range of questions that folks have had. So we'll wrap up the session. Thank you to the audience for very lively and some great questions, and to the panelists for answering some very thought-provoking questions as well. And on that note, I'll hand it back over to Dion for final comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending this event today. I have shared some links in the chat to our Reactor Meetup page, our newsletter sign up that is a monthly newsletter, and then also our Reactor YouTube page where you will be able to find this recording. If you have any questions about upcoming Reactor events, please reach out to us on the meetup pages. And thank you all again for joining, and thank you to our great panel for this event today. This was awesome. Have a great afternoon, everyone, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, folks. Thank you.